Welcome back to the Maple Popcorn Podcast. In today's episode, we have the honor of speaking with Atom Egoyan, a true icon of Canadian film whose cinematic talents have resonated with audiences worldwide. From his groundbreaking debut with Next of Kin to Exotica and the Sweet Hereafter, Egoyan has been captivating audiences with his unique storytelling and thought-provoking narratives. With his latest film, Seven Veils, Egoyan once again invites audiences into a world of introspection, reimagining the timeless tale of Salome with his trademark style and vision. His creativity extends far beyond the big screen, encompassing theater, music, and visual arts installations that challenge and inspire. His talents have been acknowledged with numerous awards, such as the Grand Prix, the International Critics Awards from the Cannes Film Festival, along with 2 Academy Award nominations for Best Director and Best Adapted Screenplay. His work has also secured the prestigious Filmmaker Prize at the Cannes Film Festival, as well as 25 Genie Awards, including 3 for Best Film. Now, let's dive into our conversation with Atom, a true master of his craft, as we discuss the insights that drive his boundless creativity. So, Atom, thank you for joining us today on the Maple Popcorn Podcast.
Sure. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, filmmaker, artist, storyteller, musician. Of all these things, which one do you think best describes you?
Well, artist seems to be all-encompassing, and it also harkens to my parents were artists. They were painters. So I come from what is an artistic family. Mm-hmm. So I like the idea that I'm carrying on that tradition. And my sister as well, she's a musician. So she would say she's a musician. And I would obviously say I'm a filmmaker, but I do theater and opera, and mm-hmm. I play guitar. But I also understand that most people know me as a filmmaker. Yeah. So I'll go with whatever you want to go.
I'll take that. But a very celebrated filmmaker at
Sure.
that. How would you people have defined your movies or described your movies in so many ways, and you as a filmmaker. So I want to know. So I was very curious. How would you define an Atom Egoyan movie?
I've come to understand that they are quite different from most movies. Like, I think when you're beginning, you see yourself in a tradition, mm-hmm. and you think you're similar to these other films that you've liked. But I do understand that I have an odd way of putting stories together, and I've directed films for other people which are more conventionally structured. Mm-hmm. But when I'm writing and directing, I have an unusual approach to time, and so I'm not thinking about things in a chronological way, mm-hmm. and that comes through when you're watching the films. And I guess that's most obvious when you watch a film like Captive, the Ryan Reynolds film, which is a thriller. It's an abduction thriller, and in a way it was inspired because I had worked with Liam Neeson on Chloe, so I knew him around the time Taken came out, and so I saw Taken, which reminded me of a Mel Gibson film called Ransom, which reminded me of many other films where fathers are trying to find their lost daughters, right? So there seems to be a formula around those types of films. But my feeling is that since there is a formula, why can't we shake that up a bit? Like, why can't we play with it and see that the daughter is alive and well at the beginning, and kind of know that at some point the father's going to have to find her. So we know that that's the plot. But then the experience of watching the film, though, mm-hmm. becomes very different. It's like, given that that's what's going to happen, then the storytelling becomes more idiosyncratic, I guess might be the mm-hmm. word. But it's organic to me. It's not like I ever wrote it in a conventional way. Like, this is the way I sort of see it in this prismatic sense, where all these timelines are kind of happening at the same experience. Because film is this way of capturing time, right? It's mm-hmm. like, that's something I learned pretty early on, that it's like these moments in time that you're piecing together. And so that's a very exciting concept for me conceptually. But it's not something most people think about. Most people are just thinking about story. Mm-hmm. And story's super important to me. Characters are super important. Emotions are very important. But the way that those are actually conveyed are different from most films. And I've come to understand that. to answer your question in a very long-winded way.
No, it's great. I'm glad you brought up Captive, because that's one of my favorite movies of yours.
Oh, thank you.
Every time.
It's the one I defend, because I think it got a really rough ride when it first came out. We premiered it at Cannes 10 years ago. And I could see there was a split between the critical response and then the public response, right? And the critics really felt it was something that I shouldn't be doing, or that it wasn't. I don't know. There was all sorts of things that they were attacking. But then in the evening when we had the public screening, I thought, oh, this went really well. And so I think people you either get it or you don't. But I think Ryan Reynolds is incredible in it, and it's a very different role for him, and he was very brave to do it at that point. And I really love the film, like, and this whole idea of this pedophile ring organized by these very rich people living in this kind of bubbled world, and the weirdness of that aspect of the film, and Ryan Reynolds just, trying to maneuver through this crazy world of a dark ring of people who do terrible things. That became more obvious since the film was released with the revelations of Jeffrey Epstein and that whole weird, awful, nightmarish world that he had created.
I even read the backstory of how you named some of the detectives based on the real story.
Yeah, well, I was obsessed with this case that had happened in Ontario, and it's interesting that the most expensive trial that's ever happened in Ontario was in the town of Cornwall, and there was this suspected pedophile ring there, and there were a number of victims who had come forward, and some of the most powerful people in the city were implicated in this, like judges and high-ranking politicians and people working for the educational board, and it was insane who was implicated. And there was this one RCMP officer whose name was Dunlop, and he till the end claimed this was true. And he was completely ostracized, and actually, it's really sad what ended up happening to him, because he was sort of hounded out of his work and there's something so disturbing about that, and that at the end of the day, it felt weirdly inconclusive. So I just began to think of this story where there was this ring of people, and you weren't quite sure how far it went as you're watching the film, and to find a way of telling the story which made you feel the uneasy sense of not knowing, so that even narratively, you're not sure where you are, what's happening. It's happening over 8 years. I think what's interesting in that film is that there's this organizing principle that every year on the birthday of the daughter, the mother goes to visit the detective who was handling the case. And once you kind of figure out that you're seeing those visits, and they're always happening on her birthday, which is the same time of year, so it's always in the winter, then you begin to understand how the structure is working, maybe. But you are, from the beginning of the film, you're seeing the present, then moving back to the past. And, if you look closely, you'll see the color of the hair in Ryan's beard changing, but it's not so obvious, right? Where and when you are.
I'm going to go try and pick up on that. Every time I go, I see I notice different things. But there seems to be a through line with your dramas about families experiencing betrayal, loss, whether we look at Next of Kin or Family Viewing or Exotica.
Yeah.
Are you often drawn to that? Are you always drawn to that kind of material? Where you find yourself exploring that a lot? Yes.
Just in terms of my own family background, I think when you're an immigrant and you come, there's that whole sense of a life you could have had, and there are people that are left behind, and my experience was very strange, because we're Armenians, but I was born in Egypt, but when we came to Canada, my parents decided to go out west, and not only as far west as Vancouver, but they went to Victoria, BC, and we were the only Armenian family there, and so we're very unlike anyone else. And so, and also as a family, I could see my relatives in Montreal as being more traditional Armenian families. And my parents, as I said at the beginning, were not traditional. They were artists. And so they made these crazy choices. And And I just became aware pretty early on of how unusual family structures are, that you're born into a family. But I was always exploring from my early dramas, like Next of Kin or Family Viewing, this idea that there are alternate families that you could choose for yourself, that there's possible, like the first film, Next of Kin, is about a boy who's in therapy, family therapy, with his parents. And by mistake, he gets the file of another family who have given up their son for adoption. And he basically tracks his family down and tells them that he is their son returning. And he doesn't look anything like them, but because it's so important for them to believe that this might be their son, they embrace him. And he comes to understand that this false family is more meaningful to him than his real family, and gives him more of a sense. Now, I don't know if it's sustainable. Like the film goes up to a certain point, and it has a comedic sort of tone, but I do believe that that's my first film. So. And I think a lot of the films, my company is called Family Viewing, and it's like a family is the smallest unit in any society. So when you're looking at a family drama, you're looking at how that society works, and it's a great way to start from, right? And then yes, of course, in Captive you have this kind of completely shattered family, because of this terrible thing where their child has been stolen. Of course, like that's the worst nightmare possible. But in all the films, like Guest of Honor, also there's this very unusual family dynamic. Obviously, Sweet Hereafter. Obviously, Exotica. A lot of the films, you're right. Yeah.
So is that what kind of maybe your own family kind of inspired you to pursue your career in filmmaking? As you said, they were not traditional.
Yes, I mean, I felt from a really early point that I liked telling stories. I liked writing dramas. Like I think we're always influenced by teachers we have. So in my school, there was this English teacher, who was writing and directing plays with students. So I saw from an early point this idea that, oh, that's so interesting. You can kind of write stories with your friends and put it on stage. And in Victoria, there was a drama festival. So I started writing plays for the Victoria Drama Festival when I was in my 13, 14. And then by the time I got to high school, I went to Mount Doug High School in Victoria, public school. But I was still writing plays for the Drama Festival, but I also began to think of films. Like there was like this, I don't know how I got into films in particular. Oh, I know how. There was this writer, this playwright that I really love, Samuel Beckett, who's best known for Waiting for Godot. And so I was really influenced by his plays. And then I realized that he had made a film with Buster Keaton. And I thought that was so interesting that he was taking his sensibility as a dramatist into film. And then I could tell you that the early films that I saw that really influenced me were from people who were coming from theater. So Ingmar Bergman, Fassbinder, these were one European theater artists who started making films at a certain point, really great films, both of them. And those were pretty inspiring.
And I think you deep down kind of knew it too, as you want to be a filmmaker, because I did hear about how you took your art to the streets for your very first film, for your short, which was Open House, when it was rejected by TIFF in 1982.
That's a crazy story.
That is a crazy story, but I've read it. I want to hear your side of it.
Okay, so what happened is this. Okay, so if any young filmmakers watching this, you'll deal with rejection, right? And you'll think that your film needs to get to a festival, especially TIFF. Like TIFF's a big festival, and it may not get in. And my first short didn't get in, but also the first short by Bruce McDonald didn't get in. And we were friends. We had worked together at that time, and so we both were pretty upset about this. So I think it was Bruce who probably had the idea, because I can't imagine that I came up with it. But Bruce had this idea of, well, why don't we just get tuxedos and get a generator and a 16 millimeter projector and put it on Bloor Street in front of, at that time, the University Cinema, which is where the galas were. Imagine it's like the Roy Thompson Hall of the day, and just start projecting our shorts on the sidewalk. So as people are coming to the gala, they can watch our short. And that's what we did. And I will never forget that. It was just so exhilarating. until we were shut down by the police. So obviously, I mean, we didn't have a permit; we were just doing it. But you know, I think there's alternate ways of getting your film out there. Now it's easier, of course. I mean, you can put it on YouTube, you can find other. But at the time, you have to realize, like, if you didn't get into a festival, there was no way anyone was going to see your film. It was a different era.
That is a wild story. I did not know that until recently, and I was like, oh, where did it
Well,
go?
here's the crazy thing: is that at the time Jeannie Becker came to interview us, and it was on Much Music, but we've never been able to find the tape because so that it would have been great to have seen the tape of it.
You have to be on a mission now to find that
Well,
tape.
I think they've looked. I remember seeing that was the best piece of publicity we got, is that they came in, and she remembers doing it as well, but we haven't found the tape.
Yeah. So you seem to not take no for an answer when it comes to...
You can't. You have to have a really thick skin. I mean, look, you're going to deal with tons of rejection. I mean, like and I'm not coming from a place where there's family money. So for the first films, I was applying for grants, Arts Council grants. And you know, sometimes you got them, sometimes you didn't, you know, and sometimes you got part of it and you had to shoot. And like films were really expensive. Like my first film, that one feature, Next of Kin, it cost $25,000. That seems like nothing, but at the time, like if you don't have $25,000, that's a ton of money, and especially, you know, in 1984, 40 years ago, I mean, most of that budget would have gone to film stock. So what's interesting now is that you could still actually shoot a feature for that amount digitally. Like if you are, you know, not paying for locations and you're working with friends, and you know, you don't have to work with like all of the constraints that you normally would. I think I could still shoot that film if I was like that age now, you know, because we didn't pay we just shot it on the streets, right? So I think I could probably still make it for the same amount of money.
Oh, yeah?
I think so. I mean, but of course, you know, I couldn't because I wouldn't be paying people properly, right? But but at the time as well, like we were just all doing it for free and doing it out of passion and love, right?
Yeah. So do you think that's what has probably helped you to pave your path in the industry, that kind of motto, that mindset of not being no for an answer?
Not taking no for an answer, but also, like, here's the thing is gradually like building an audience, right? Like, so it was, it took, like most people, like they look at a film like Exotica and they go, oh, like that's amazing. Like you made that and you broke through. But yeah, that was feature number 7 though. Or, you know, I'd made a number of like much smaller films leading up to Exotica. And so an audience was gradually being built. And I think that's, I was impatient and very driven, but I also understood that I couldn't just leap ahead to make, you know, a film for $1 million. I had to make these much smaller films and kind of prove that there was a market, because I've always been very aware of that. I guess because I saw what happened with my parents, who had such struggles as painters, like raising a family, and ended up not being able to raise their family on their art. They had a furniture store in Victoria, and I was working at this furniture store from a young age as a child, and I could see that like you needed to actually sell your work in order to continue surviving, right? Like, so I've always been aware of that, and the films have needed to find a market. As small as that market might be, it's the only way you can keep doing work in a way. Yeah,
I'm surprised that having that background with knowing your parents as artists and seeing what they've been through, you didn't let that discourage you of what rejection could feel like as an artist.
I mean, let's also be clear. I didn't, when I moved to Toronto, it wasn't to be a filmmaker. I came to study international relations at the University of Toronto. I didn't think I would have a career as an artist. And so I wanted to find like something that I could do professionally. And I actually had this fantasy that I would work in foreign affairs, that I would be a diplomat. But while I was studying these things, there was like a drama society at the university. There was a film club, and I started making short films while I was at university. And I always knew this is what I really wanted to do, but I didn't know how I would make a living at it, right? But once I graduated and I realized I was going to commit myself to it, that was the scariest time. I think it's pretty terrifying when you realize that, like, you're on your own. You know, like, it's you have to have a really thick skin.
When did you feel like you've made it? That your arrival on the world stage, on the Canadian cinematic stage, anyways, when did you feel like you've you're finally there?
It would be Exotica, probably. Yeah, Exotica going into competition in Cannes. Like I'd been to some other festivals, and I'd been to the Cannes Festival with other films in the Director's Fortnight. But I remember going in 1989 with my third feature, Speaking Parts. And at the same time, Denis Arcand's film, Jesus of Montreal, was in the competition. And going into that cinema, the Grand Salle Lumière in Cannes, and going, oh wow, this is where you want to have a film. Like it just felt like, okay, this is when you know you've made it. When you have a film in this cinema, and the world is watching it. And the funniest thing was that the film I made after that, The Adjuster, I thought would go there to that cinema, and they liked it. But they didn't invite it into competition. They invited it into this other section called Certain Regard, which is not in that theater. And I had the arrogance to say no. And I turned down their offer and showed it at the Director's Fortnight again, which now seems like absurd. But and then when I submitted Exotica, they didn't immediately take it either. But they ended up at the last moment inviting it to competition, and it won the International Critics Award. So that moment when it won the International Critics Award was a huge deal, like not only for my own career, but in terms of the sales of the film and the fact that at the time, Miramax, which was like one of the leading American distribution companies, picked it up, and it was the breakthrough film.
I do want to talk a little bit about Exotica. It has been described as a masterpiece in storytelling. And tell me a little bit about the process of that and what was in terms of the storytelling.
Well, not dissimilar to what we talked about with The Captive, right? I mean, where you're going back and forth, in terms of there's a present day, but there's key elements of what's happening in the present which remain very mysterious. Like, why is this man, Francis Brown, in this club? What's the nature of his relationship to this young dancer? Why is she dressed in this costume? What's the energy of what's happening? And that theme sort of flows through at a number of different ways, and it builds and it reveals itself a bit like an onion, like peeling an onion. There are different layers, and it builds in intensity, and it probably has, I could say modestly, the best ending I've ever come up with. And I could say that because the ending revealed itself to me very late in the process, like almost as, we'd already written the script, we'd already gone into pre-production, and then the ending where the final, the final sort of layer of the onion is revealed. And you understand the connection between Francis Brown and this dancer. I'm giving it away a little bit, but it has a very strong emotional resonance. I think that one of the reasons why it's so strong is that the viewer kind of discovers it in the same way that I discovered it as a writer. It's sort of like it doesn't feel at all formulaic. And sometimes endings do, just because so many people have to approve of the ending. But I was very fortunate at the time to be working with a distribution company, Alliance, which was a strong company run by Robert Lantosh here in Canada. And they were really giving me a ton of freedom. Basically, they were saying, if you can keep your budgets low, you give us a title and you just, you provide us with a film. Of course, the unwritten thing is, and you get it into the Cannes Film Festival, because that gave them the marketing clout they needed to sell the film. So it made them happy, I guess, right? but it was a really wonderfully symbiotic relationship, where we were able to, I was able to keep the budgets low. I was working with a really great team. I had a wonderful producing partner, Camelia Freiberg, and we made these 7 films together, really. So as producers, she was very, very good about keeping the budgets low. And
so I'm curious, you said a lot of people have to approve the ending, and I think one of the film things I love about your films, I love the endings. It's not what I ever see coming. It's very different. So I'm curious if there's a film that you were told that no, to not make it that way, but you went ahead with it and chose that ending because you stuck to your vision.
Well, I could tell you a funny story about that, where I tried to do that, and that was Chloe. Now, Chloe is a film that I didn't write, but I had this perfect ending in mind, which would have been for me, because I'm not happy with the ending of that film, to be honest. Like I felt, because I came to love Chloe. Like I love that character, and I loved working with Amanda, and which is why I worked with Amanda again on this new film, Seven Veils. But I didn't want to have Chloe die. I didn't think she needed to die, and so and in the original script that I got, she died horrifically. Like Liam Neeson came into the house and basically found her in bed with their son, and he just went crazy and killed her, like Fatal Attraction or something. So I said to the producer, I said, I can't shoot that ending. Like, it's just not in me. And I remember this conversation where Ivan said, but you understand she needs to die. And I said, well, I'm not so sure she does. And I'd like to propose an ending where she doesn't, and where the parents come and find her in bed with their son, and they're in shock, and she just puts on her clothes and leaves the house. And he said, well, the audience is not going to like that. And I said, well, here's the thing, is that I'll shoot an ending where she does die, but it's the ending you see in the film.
Right.
But without costing anything more, I mean, I want to shoot this alternate ending that I have in mind, because it's the same location. So we did, and we tested it with an audience in Los Angeles, and they hated it. Like you could feel that they wanted her to die, or it needed something else. So because it was just that sort of a film. It was in the DNA of the film, right?
Yeah.
So it's very interesting. So that was an ending that it didn't work, but maybe it's because the DNA of the film needed something more formulaic, right? So it's tricky. And I've come to realize that there's a split between the films that I direct from other people's scripts, like Remembers and Devil's Knots and Chloe, that I will bring a sensibility to it. Like, there are scenes in Chloe which I think are some of the best scenes I've directed, just because of what I'm getting from the actors. But I'm not the writer. I'm not creating the overall structure. Right. And those films are not operating by the same principle that I've just mentioned, in terms of how they're layered.
So you feel that there's no more autonomy or the freedom when you write the story as well? And
of course there is. Of course there is. But I also have come to understand that those films are getting more challenging to make, right? So
why is that?
Well, just because the market, you can tell, like, people don't have the same attention span that they used to when they're watching a film. Like people, like the types of dramas that are really successful right now, like interesting dramas, are films like, let's say, Baby Reindeer, for instance, right now on Netflix, which is great. But you're also understanding that there's this energy where you kind of know where you are moment to moment, right? It's not based on this more, can I be pretentious and say, ontological kind of examination of where the viewer places themselves and how they're organizing a structure. Like, those are concerns that are really important to me as a storyteller, like that there be genuine mystery in terms of what and how time is being organized. But I'm not so sure if we're living in a moment where people have the patience for that anymore.
So do you change the kinds of projects that now when you look at projects, does that affect the decision when it comes to whether you're going to take it, whether you're going to write it?
That's a good question. I think this is a moment for me to think about that, for sure. Like, I do think that I'm beginning to realize that maybe I should be thinking of other formats. I should be thinking of TV series, or I should be thinking of other ways of finding, because the feature film is a very particular type of way of telling a story. And I'm very proud of these films that I've made, and I've been really fortunate, that they're, unlike when I do an opera or a piece of theater, which is very temporary, it just kind of, it's very much of that moment and then it disappears. But films are forever, and so it's great that these films are available on streaming services, and that they are still, they are preserved, right? But they are huge undertakings, and so, the way that they get made is that there is a market identified for them. Like, people, like make no mistake. I mean, yes, you do get some what's called soft money, like, from tax credits or, equity financing from, telefilm or provincial sort of, but you still have to raise at least a third of the budget on market principles. You have to be, so if you're making a film that's costing like $6 million, you have to raise like 2 million by people who believe that the film has a market. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, the lower the budget, and so I think that's what's very liberating about people who are working on their first features and working on much smaller budgets, is that you don't have those constraints. But when you're working with, I would say, more professional crews, and certainly shooting in Toronto, which has gotten very expensive, you have to think about what the market for the film is going to be.
Your work often blurs the lines between reality and fiction, and it's one of the things I love about it, because I never know what. It's interesting because it invites viewers to question the perceptions of truth and memory. How do you navigate this balance between it, and has that always been your style?
Yeah, I think you navigate it by
the balance.
Well, it's what you're feeling. Like, it's an emotional response. Like these are feelings that you have as you're writing and as you're conceiving and as you're imagining actors. You're thinking of what they're carrying in terms of their own experience and their own memories, and how that's affecting their behavior. So I'm always thinking about, maybe as I'm writing, what I would be saying to the actors in terms of where they are and what they're trying to negotiate, and I think that meetings between human beings are very mysterious. Like, I'm thinking about the fact that we're having this conversation right now. Here's the structure. We're having an interview. So, what does that mean? And let's say in the new film, Seven Veils, there's a very provocative podcast scene, right? Like where Amanda is being interviewed by someone who knows a lot more about her than she thinks, right? Which again would, right now my mind is racing. Like, what if you start asking me these questions that I would not expect you to know, right? And then suddenly that takes the conversation to a whole other place.
Right.
I have to assess whether or not this is real, maybe because it's so intense, like what you're asking, like how could you know that? No one else knows that, and suddenly you have access to it. So this is the type of thing that I'm always aware of, is like, well, how it is that people have to deal with their own ability to understand their minds, right? Like, to understand the limits of what is rational in a world where the irrational seems to be so much more accepted, right? Like, we are living in crazy times, and we're living in a space where so many people have access to image making technologies. I think that's one of the things that's important about my films, maybe, is that when I started making films in the 80s, like, it was just at this moment when people were able to use these technologies in their own families, right? Like, yes, people were always making home movies, but home movies are on film, and so you have to be very selective about what you're shooting. But the moment video came into it in the 80s, people could be videotaping like large sections of their family life. And that really shifts the relationship we have to memory, because suddenly things that are like everyday events, like 8mm movies were very selected in terms of what they were shooting, because you only had so much time, but video just allows you to keep running. And so that comes up in a lot of the movies, like the use of home video, even in the new film, in Seven Veils, and the way she's haunted by these videos that she made as a child, but with her father, like those things come back, and the videos of the previous production that she's now trying to remount. And so this idea of where, like, what happens in our organic memory, like what we've actually experienced, and what happens to us from what we've been given by other people's experience. So here, I'll give you an example how this affected me. So I was born in, my early years were in Egypt, and people say, do you remember Egypt? Well, I remember from a very early point, my father projecting 8mm movies of Egypt. So I have a memory of myself as a child in the Cairo Zoo, but I can't really ascertain whether or not that's an actual memory, or that I've watched myself as a child at the zoo. And there's this crazy moment where my father puts me, I know you're going to go, wow, talk about traumatizing a kid, but puts I don't know if it's my dad, but someone at the zoo puts me on the shoulders of this giant ape. And you could see me like as a little kid, I'm terrified. Like I'm obviously not supposed to be on the shoulders of another primate. It just doesn't. And yet there I am. And that was probably one of those moments where a moment of trauma was actually filmed because it was thought to be cute.
Right.
And then I had to like watch it as a kid and try and analyze what that experience meant to me.
So that is the visceral, but that's exactly, I know what you mean, because now you're trying to remember whether that actually happened or you saw yourself in a photo and thinking that happened.
Right. So people have that experience with dreams a lot, right? Like, and so there is this intersection between, like moments where you would have dreamt something and or maybe seen it in a way that's out of context, or and people have this this whole question of like images that are suppressed or repressed, or and why they've been buried or how they come back, and all that stuff is fascinating.
If you're craving more Canadian film inspiration, head over to telfilm.ca/see-it-all, where you can explore a wealth of film collections available on your favorite streaming platforms. From iconic classics to exciting new releases, there's something for everyone right at your fingertips. If you're loving the insights from our esteemed guests, be sure to subscribe to the Maple Popcorn Podcast on your preferred platform, and don't forget to leave us a review. It is fascinating. Speaking of which, I've seen Seven Whales twice already, but it makes me want to go back and think about, not that you mentioned the podcast and putting me on the spot here, but you not only directed another rendition of Salome at the Four Seasons Center, but you also filmed the movie at the same time.
Yeah.
Which is insane.
Insane. It was totally insane. It was an insane moment. But I think what's interesting with Seven Veils for me is actually, it's a character who actually understands the traumas that she's, to the point where she's spoken about it with many people. But what she doesn't anticipate is what it means to reconstruct those things in the context of this opera. Like that, she wanders into this kind of zone where suddenly I think she's expected to do one thing, which is just remount the opera. But suddenly she begins to understand that there are other agendas at play, and that begins to affect her. I wouldn't go so far as to say her sanity, because I think I don't think she actually has a psychic break, but she's on the edge of one at one point, and it's pretty clear that it's the result of these things that are colliding, and it's just her inability to have understood or anticipated how fraught this moment was going to be.
It was really well made, and Amanda gives an
amazing performance. Yeah, like I just loved working with her on Chloe so much, and we kept talking about finding another project, but it really wasn't until I wrote this or thought of this character that I went, okay, well, this is the right thing. And then of course, because she was so busy, she just won the Emmy for The Dropout, and then you just sort of pray that she's going to be available. And we couldn't move the dates. Like it had to be while Salome was on stage here at the Four Seasons. So that made it really, really tough.
Yeah. What sparked the idea, though, the fascination of doing the behind the scenes of this artistic director and her experience? Where did you get that idea from?
It was because I had remounted this production. It was very successful from the time it was first presented in the mid-90s. And so when it was being put on again for the seventh time, I mean, not just Toronto, it's traveled around different places, but I thought, okay, so wouldn't it be interesting to have a different interpretation? But I realized you can't, because of the budget of an opera. You have to kind of remount what's there. So I started writing this as a different interpretation, right? Like creating a character that was adding another layer to it. So I had this crazy idea, which sounds so naive, that somehow this would not be such a big thing because we're in rehearsals and it's on stage anyhow, that we would just be like a fly on the wall and kind of be shooting this film at the same time. And then I realized, this is a much more ambitious film than I thought. And so then it became a bit scary. Like, are we going to be able to actually do this? And then there are all, issues around, we're still in COVID in a way. And so there were so many pressures. I won't even go into it, but I was so driven. Like, I just thought this was such an incredible opportunity. And I just thought, like, I knew the cast that we had for this production of Salome was really a unique cast. And I also felt that Amanda, like, this was the role, this was the thing that would bring us, finally, able to work together again, 15 years after Chloe. So it was, I'm so grateful we were able to make it.
So what is the shot that got you when you look back, you go, I can't believe we actually did that. We were able to get that. When you look back, your hardest.
Well, I mean, you mean in this particular film?
Yes, in this film.
I guess it's that moment where there's the dance happening and we just at the last moment sort of thought, well, since the dancer is there and since we're shooting it and since we have Amanda that day, why not kind of put her like on stage in the middle of the dance and have the dance all happening around her physically as she's remembering these things. And I think that when I see her at that moment in the film, like I'm going, okay, that's kind of extraordinary. Because when I wrote it, I didn't have that in mind. It felt like it would be too much, but it wasn't. It was like kind of the perfect sort of moment, like for her to experience that. And I think it was really, really exciting for her as an actress to be in the middle of this other performance, knowing what was being generated and what had happened in her past, right?
That was a powerful moment.
Yeah,
when it's on her face.
I get the impression you're thinking of another moment, though. Is that right?
Not really. I had a few things, but I was just wondering, because the idea that you're balancing two different acts and you're trying to vision what the movie is going to look like, but at the same time you are directing that.
Yeah.
Salome. So I was just wondering what in your mind, what was the toughest shot? That's why.
Yeah, that would be probably also to compound that, I mean, that shot was actually made on the toughest shooting day I've ever had. So it was like there was so much stuff we had to shoot that day, and we had more cameras than I've ever had shooting something because it was our big extra day. We had to shoot all the stuff with the orchestra, the actual orchestra. So it was like that we got that shot in as well, is kind of a miracle.
Why do you find yourself, drawn to adapting this classic tale? That was the first question I thought about when I was watching this.
You have to wonder why this story has persisted, and has had so many incarnations. And I just saw this incredible feature, Toronto-made feature, like weirdly that it's happening in the same time that we shot our film. There's a film called Salome Learns to Dance, and it's this Toronto actress, Miranda Calderon, who plays like 10 different characters in like she's the only person that you see in the film, but she's playing Salome, but all the other characters as well. But in this weird modern version of this actress who's putting on the play by Oscar Wilde. And I'm going, how weird that in like 50 years, someone's going to look back at the cultural history of Toronto and say, what happened in 2023, 24, that these two films were made at the same time? Why was this story, why did it still have such a hold? And it has to do with the idea of what are the limits to desire? What are when you feel that something is within your grasp and it's something that's going to be transformative to you and you need to experience it, but somehow there's something that's holding you back. And there's something, I mean, we know Oscar Wilde wrote it, the play, and he was drawn to the story from the Bible, but he changes it very radically, because in the Bible, Salome asked for the head of John the Baptist at the bequest of her mother, Herodias. It's not Salome's decision, but Oscar Wilde makes it really clear in the play that it's her choice, and that she says it's nothing to do with my mother, and so she's taking full responsibility for this action. And when you look at Oscar Wilde's life and what he ended up doing in terms of taking responsibility for this crazy action that would actually end up destroying his life, I won't get into the details, but it's really him wrestling with his sexuality and what the limits of it were in the society he was living in as a gay man. What he had to suppress and what he had to hide, and then the way Richard Strauss saw this play in German and was inspired to write this incredible music. Like the music is just insane, like the way it's written. And so there's this thing that continues the fascination. But let's remember that it's always a male line. Like it's the people who transcribed the Bible were male. All the 19th century artists, including Oscar Wilde, were male. Richard Strauss is male. The director in my opera version is male. I'm male. So this idea of it being reclaimed by a female character, in the case of Janine, or in the case of this filmmaker I was telling you about, Miranda, like that's really appealing at this point, to give to let someone else actually examine what it is about this character that makes her so enduring. And she is enduring. Like she continues to have a hold on people. I don't know if I have an answer to that. I just know that it was very compelling to me.
Yeah, you could tell that it's a film that means a lot to you, at least emotionally, as well as taking the story through and to always go back to it. So
yeah.
I want to talk quickly about also the Sweet Hereafter, your Oscar nomination. I don't do 2 Oscar nominations for Best Director and Adapted Screenplay. When it comes to that, like, you explored themes, again, of grief, of loss, of human condition. What inspired you to tackle this emotional story and this subject matter?
Look, there's a theme that comes up in all of these films, and it's coming from my adolescence, and it's coming from a relationship that I experienced. So it was this collision of art making and parenting and awakening sexuality and the way that can be abused or manipulated. That comes up in Sweet Hereafter as well. And so if you were to read the book, The Sweet Hereafter, it's very different in tone from the film, because in the book she's like a young athlete, and her her father is kind of trying to is there to support her as a young athlete. But I've transformed it into the fact that she's a singer, and the father's really involved in her stage show and kind of getting, and there's this whole use of the poetry of Robert Browning, which is not in the book, and the Pied Piper of Hamelin, and this idea of this weird way in which recalling and adjoining these traumatic experiences with art, with works of art, somehow interprets these feelings of that are confusing and that are somehow not resolved. And so that it becomes very comforting, but also might also extend this process of traumatization. So I guess that's where Salome, the story of my experience with that, with the opera, with the play, how it seemed to kind of answer certain questions about the trauma of abuse. But The Sweet Hereafter allowed me something which was very unique, which I felt that I could access the experience of someone who's experiencing this as it was happening, who hadn't understood how violent that was at the time, had to create sort of a myth of them for themselves of what was actually happening in this abusive relationship with her father. And I happen to have an amazing actress to do that with Sarah Polley. So Sarah Polley was playing a character in Exotica, and from the moment we worked together, I realized, okay, this is an exceptional human being. And when I wrote this version of Nicole from the novel, I was thinking of Sarah. It was one of the few times I was writing something and I had Sarah in mind, because I knew that she could actually present the complexity of Nicole in this new interpretation. So again, she's very different from the Nicole Burnell in the book, but in order to take that bold move of reinterpreting her, I needed to know and have an actress in mind, and she provided that.
It's very interesting, your expression as an artist, and how I see connections with your entire work. Now that you've mentioned that, there is a see-through line of how you see your work and you want it on screen, and I feel like it has been done very successfully.
Oh, thank you. I mean, it's great to have a longer conversation like this about that, because I've said things and come to realize, like maybe things I hadn't really thought of, but it's therapeutic. It's therapeutic, but again, like I promise, I'm not going to take this podcast and make it into something other than it's not. Though it's kind of tempting to kind of think that suddenly it's going to become demonic, and you're going to start telling me that you can read the mind of the giant chimp that I was put on in the Egypt
gosh, can you imagine
in the Cairo zoo. Yeah.
It's hilarious. Your name carries weight. You have this imprint on cinema, not just Canadian cinema, but global cinema. What is the legacy you want with your body of work? If that's something you've thought about, or some, especially with the way you're exercising demons, as you said, throughout your work, but the way you storytell, is that, do you think about legacy?
I'm not the person to say, like what I think that legacy is. I just know I feel very privileged that I've been able to make these films, and I also know that this could only have been done through the Canadian system. So, yes, Maple Popcorn. I mean, it is definitely, these are Canadian films. These are resolutely Canadian films. Even the films that I made in other places, like Devil's Knot or Chloe. Like Chloe is interesting because it was shot in Toronto, but actually, this is an interesting note. It's the first foreign studio film that used Toronto as Toronto.
Oh, really?
So yeah,
which is very rare.
Like the year after Scott Pilgrim, I think was probably the second film that did that, but it was the first film. And originally when I got the script, it was set in San Francisco, and I convinced the producers that we could shoot it in Toronto and have Toronto play Toronto. So even though it's a studio film, Studio Canal from France, I feel like it is. It's part of my Toronto-based kind of identity. Like this is, who, like the films are very much in, like even a film like Calendar that we shot in Armenia, my character, the character that I play in that film is very much in their home in Toronto, right? So like the films seem to have something about the sensibility of this particular place. And also, like, I think Sweet Hereafter, it feels very much like BC. Like I'm also, coming from BC as well. So that feels very British Columbia. It's set in, a very specific part of that province as well. But they're Canadian films. They're definitely Canadian movies.
I love that you're a proud Canadian filmmaker who's constantly putting Toronto on the map. You've had 18 TIFF premieres in 4 decades.
Yeah.
That's what do you think is particularly unique about Canadian filmmaking?
Well, I think that if you're able to keep the budgets low, and if you're able to think of a market, you're able to actually have a lot more freedom to make those films than if you were working in another more commercial system. Like, that's not to say that like you don't have to respond to notes, but not in the same way that if you're dealing with a studio film or. And careers, I'm not sure about now, but, at that time, careers could just develop, more gradually. Like I felt that I was able to make these films, but not be in the full glare of, like maybe I was just allowed to grow, like have a career that developed gradually. Honestly, though, because those were the budgets I could raise. I mean, I guess if I could have raised millions of dollars after my first feature, I probably would have tried, but I just couldn't. Like I had to kind of do it step by step by step, and build it, and the system allowed me to do that.
How do you see the Canadian film industry evolving? Especially, you've been in the industry for 4 decades. You've seen the highs and lows. How do you see it evolving?
Well, I do think streaming has changed things a lot. So streaming has made things much more readily available, but it means that you need to. It's more difficult to get attention placed on a film. So festivals take on a different type of importance, I suppose, and. But let's face it, like algorithms actually come into play, I suppose, right? So that little thing that happens at the bottom of your streamer where after you watch something, if you like this, you might like that, and the fact that we now have algorithms that are determining what we might want to see, like that changes things so that it's easier to make things in some ways in a niche if you're prepared to make things for very low budgets. But if you want to make things like for higher budgets, you have to be able to prove to your financiers that there is a following. And that becomes really clear because of the way algorithms work and also social media works. Like, I've seen it now with casting. Like, actors are expected to have a social media following.
Right.
When they get cast. Like, that seems like a pressure I would never have imagined when I was younger, right? So every generation has its own way of understanding its own relevance, right? So I hesitate to kind of like give any advice or say how things work now, because I'm actually coming from a different time. All I can say is I'm thankful that the older films are available, but I'm not sure if they could have been made in this culture right now. So but that's okay. Like, artists will find a way of adapting to the needs of the society that they're facing, right?
So then, what is the hope? What do you hope for the future of Canadian entertainment?
One of the things I hope has happened, which is that there seems to be some legislation where the streamers have to give back. Right. And I just signed a petition where it's not just for like streaming production, but also for features as well. So it's not just for miniseries or limited series. It's like 20% of that fund should go to features, because we have amazing young filmmakers. Like, I've seen incredible first features over the past few years, and I just want those people to have careers, right? I want them to have the same opportunities I had. I do think that they, if they can find a way to allow themselves to gradually, grow an audience, as opposed to, try and design that second feature that's going to like catapult them into the mainstream. Like, I don't know if that's a healthy way to grow as an artist. So I think that, but again, I'm only speaking from my own experience. Like, I wasn't prepared to make that leap after, my first feature, Next of Kin. I wanted to make the family viewings and the speaking parts and the adjusters, but they were smaller films, right? Each one gradually like bigger, but not that monumental jump, which a lot of young filmmakers are experiencing, that where they make a feature that breaks through and suddenly they're given like this huge studio film, right? And that's super tempting. I understand it, but it also means that you are perhaps forfeiting some of your ability to grow as an artist.
Do you think you'd still say no if that same option was presented to you now?
Weirdly enough, because of my own kind of stubbornness, like it was, I'll tell you an interesting story. Like, after I made my first feature and I was doing family viewing, there was this weird technique that I'm using in family viewing where I'm live switching in the scenes as though the characters are watching a soap opera version of their own lives. And I remember at the time, Telefilm, because my first feature got some attention, they said, well, we'll support it, but, we'd like you to shoot it, in kind of a more conventional way, and in case this other technique doesn't work, right? And I actually said at the time, no. I said that, no, I'd prefer not to have your financing and make it smaller, because it's very important for me that I just do it this way. I had this weird stubbornness, I guess, about like, this is the way it had to be artistically. But I have to say that shifted in, the moment we had a child, and I realized, oh my God, I have responsibilities and I needed, to think about, raising a family. But thankfully, the blessing of my career is that happened around the time I made Exotica. And so I was given those opportunities. But even there, I turned away from the studio film. I don't know if you know this story, but after Exotica, I had a contract with Warner Brothers to do this thriller. But at the end, the option of Sweet Hereafter was running out, and I promised Russell Banks I would do this film. And I actually walked away from the studio film so I could make the Sweet Hereafter.
Right. Wasn't it called something Deadly?
Yeah, Dead Sleep.
Dead Sleep.
Yeah,
there we go.
And it was with Susan Sarandon and and here's the crazy thing, is that film never ended up getting made. And the same thing happened, after the Sweet Hereafter was nominated. I got this huge offer to do a studio film for Universal, and Felicia's journey just felt like it was more real, like it was, and I was able to write it, and I was able to work with another writer I love, William Trevor, and they were giving me a lot of freedom, and that just seemed more appealing than the studio option, even though if that film had happened, I would have made a lot more money, I guess. When I look at the career of Denis Villeneuve, that was really fortunate because, he was ready to make those films at a very high level, and they actually happened, right?
So some people might say stubbornness, as you said, but I think it's just having vision and gut instinct on doing this.
Yeah. I mean, it's a weird thing where I feel like you have to feel like I need to feel that there's something I'm bringing to a project which makes it unique to the way I would do it, right? As opposed to thinking that someone else could do this better than I. And the one film I could say that maybe is my least interesting film is probably because there was a director who might have been able to have a more interesting take on it. And my point of view was maybe not the right point of view for the way that story needed to be told. I'm talking about Devil's Knot. And I can justify what I thought was interesting about the film, but it was probably not what that particular story needed. It needed a very strong point of view. And my point of view was that there was no point of view ultimately, that this thing had happened. There was going to be no answer to it. And these people had to just live in this state of grief, and there was no solution. And that's an odd way to tell a story, but that's what felt true to me when I got that material. And when people look at the documentaries on that subject matter, the documentaries have a really clear point of view, which is that this is the guilty person or that's the guilty person. And you get that feeling, and it's pretty thrilling when you're watching it. But look, none of the people that they point the fingers to was ever found guilty.
Right.
And we were making the feature film after all of that. And we're going, okay, so if no one is ever going to be found guilty, what does that mean in terms of how the pain of this loss, hangs? How does that hang in this community and with these people? So maybe I wasn't the right person to tell that particular story, because people have such a strong sense that these boys were either guilty or not guilty, or the stepfathers were either guilty or not guilty. And I, maybe because of my sensibility...
But you have a different take on it.
I definitely have a different take. And so when you ask me about my films, but that wasn't my decision. That was a producer inviting me, to do it. And I went, okay, that's interesting. I'll say yes. So, but maybe that producer should have, decided on someone else, right?
No, but it's very admirable for you to say that, I may have not been the best, because not every director, once they've done a film, will come back and say that. So, well,
it's just that you have to, again, I am someone who,
But I thought it was well made, just saying.
I think it's well made. I just think that it feels as though that it needs here's the crazy thing about that story, honestly, is that as we were shooting it, I'll never forget this moment. This police officer who is like a paid duty officer, like on when you're shooting, you have the people who are there to kind of make sure the traffic is moving or not. So he was from West Memphis, and he, at one point it was lunch, and I was talking to him. He said, well, it's pretty clear what happened. And I went, you really, you know the answer? He goes, well, yeah. I mean, this whole thing about how the kids were found with these very carefully tied knots in their own shoelaces, and the way the evidence was all scrubbed, it was clearly done by professionals. I was going, okay. He said, well, clearly the two stepfathers seem to have been involved with drugs and drug trafficking. I was going, yeah, and that was clear. We knew that. He said, well, what probably happened is that they stumbled or crossed paths with the Mexican drug cartel, because West Memphis is this major intersection where, there's like all sorts of I shouldn't be saying all this because it's like totally unsubstantiated, but as he was telling me, I was going, oh yeah, that makes, why hasn't anyone figured that out? That the two boys were targeted. The third kid just happened to be there as a friend. So he was and I was going, oh wow, I guess that does seem like the most compelling answer. Because here's the crazy thing about that story. The reality is, it's eerie. It's eerie how little evidence there was. And these knots that are so carefully tied. And it just feels like something demonic has happened. And so when that happens in a spiritual community like that, then they have to find demons. That only makes sense. And so they find the demons in these three kids. But when you think about it, I mean, if it's designed to scare these people, then the drug cartel motive becomes pretty compelling, and it explains a lot.
Wow, fascinating.
But now here's the big question: if I knew that while we were prepping the film, as opposed to hearing this on the last day of the shoot, would I have like restructured it? Well, first of all, it wasn't like I didn't write the script, but would I brought that into the story? I'm not so sure, right? Because then maybe the story would have been less interesting to me. Like it would have been like a more conventional story, right? As opposed to this thing which is just hanging unresolved.
I think at the end of the day, it just depends on, it's also an entertaining story. Then you're watching and you want to know more because there are different theories. Everyone has their own theory, but watching it, you kind of want to know, oh, could this have happened? Or could that have happened?
Yeah,
so
because I think we were inspired by, like this book, less than the documentaries, the book, like, which are just throwing away, like giving you all these possible theories, right? But this theory that I've just told you about the Mexican drug cartel hit is something that I haven't, like I'm telling you for the first time.
Oh,
so
really?
So
we
here.
got some fresh content.
Yes, we have some very fresh content, and now the Mexican drug cartel will be after you and me.
Oh, fabulous! Speaking of demonic, all this demonic stuff that we're talking about, that's so crazy. That's hilarious.
So on that note,
and I will end on that hilariously. But your films have garnered critical acclaim. They've left a lasting impression on audiences. So, is there a particular film or a moment that you're most proud of? Besides this interview.
Yeah, besides the interview, besides the fact that I've taken down a Mexican drug cartel, besides that moment where I solved the mystery of the West Memphis 3. I'm super proud of Ararat. Yeah, I'm super proud that I made that film. Like, so this is the film that it won like for Best Canadian Film in 2002, and it's dealing with issues of my own background, and it's a pretty, like, I know it's not the most perfect film. I know that there's like there are films that I made that are more like better made, but like the fact that I went there and I had the opportunity to explore this issue of my own background and the Armenian genocide, the denial of the Armenian genocide, that to me is like very, like I'm proud of that. Like that I got to make that film, even though I know it kind of affected my career. Like a lot of people were surprised by it, but I'm pretty proud of that film. Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing. I can't wait to see what you do next. Like what's the next film you're working on after Seven Veils, obviously.
Yeah. Well, if you see images of me in the jungles working with a drug cartel, and I'm on a most wanted list, you'll know that you'll know why.
It will be the results of this.
You'll know it's because of this and that you're implicated. This is the moment where everything changed.
Pivotal moment right here. Thank you so much, Adam, for joining us on this podcast and for that fascinating discussion.
Okay, thank you.
That was hilarious. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Maple Popcorn Podcast. Be sure to subscribe to us on your preferred platform, give us a rating, and leave us a review. The Maple Popcorn Podcast is produced by The Brand is Female and powered by Telefilm Canada. For more Canadian film inspiration, please visit telefilm.ca/see-it-all. I'm your podcast host, Marriska Fernandes, and thank you for joining us today. Don't forget to follow Telefilm Canada and The Brand is Female on all social media platforms.